This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
Paul Verschure with the Convergent Science Network podcast. I'm here with my colleague Tony Prescott at our Barcelona Cognition, Brain and Technology Summer School for 2018, where our guest Bjorn Merker, welcome to the podcast, Bjorn, has given a tutorial on the different systems of the brain and how they're organized, especially from an anatomical perspective, right? And then also what possibly the functional consequences of this organization could be. So, Bjorn, how many systems would you distinguish in the mammalian brain? How many subsystems would you consider as being relevant?
Well, what I did in the tutorial was try to, first of all, raise some problems about what we mean by systems and how to define them. Because anatomically, I made one example. For example, take midbrain and diencephalon. In our anatomical nomenclature, we divide them up into two clear compartments, diencephalon and midbrain. But if you look, I showed horizontal sections, and it's an absolutely uniform greasium, gray matter with various nuclei, and you can't see any distinction between them. And then you look at embryology and molecular markers for developmental processes, and you see that midbrain and diencephalon in its origin is one unit. And it's the unit that receives terminals from the optic tract, the midbrain does. And so I call it the optic brain. And so that was to try to make a little problem out of how we define a system. So, anatomically, when I was looking at brains myself, you took the posterior commissure was the dividing line. Behind that is midbrain, and in front of that. But functionally and in terms of circuitry, you can't see a border between them. So I tried to make a little problem out of defining systems. And then I said, well, we can use approach from, for example, systems theory or cellular analysis of cell function. There you have clear division of labor between the different organelles. They're each doing a specific thing. The mitochondria are doing metabolism, and endoplasmic reticulum is doing DNA work, and Golgi apparatus and so on. Each has its function, and they all work together. And when they stop working together, the cell is dead. The system is gone. So if you look at this in terms of the division of labor, what would you like the system parts of the total system? What would you like them to do? Well, you would like them to have rather clear-cut generic functions. And if you think about that, you would also expect that if there is a system and it's anatomically visible, it would have a pretty redundant structure. And the classical example, of course, is cerebellum, which has this crystalline structure redundant throughout. And, you would have to be pretty much out of your mind not to think that wherever in the cerebellum you are, that circuitry is doing something similar across the whole cerebellum. So a generic function and reflected in a clear-cut structure. The cortex, neocortex is similarly very uniform in its structure. The basal ganglia is also, but they're all very different in their structures. So by that kind of reasoning, by showing lots of pictures of these things, you can start saying, well, maybe there is a reason to divide this thing up into the higher functions, into systems, division of labor between basal ganglia, cerebellum, and neocortex, or actually cortex as a whole, because the hippocampus, for example, is simply the top of the hierarchy in a sense of the cortical hierarchy. Then as you go down, midbrain, you have this clear-cut, very well-defined, which I wouldn't hesitate to call a system, which is the colliculus. You have the extensions of the basal ganglia down into the midbrain. And then, of course, you have the brainstem, which is just this massive collection of very, very specific circuitry having to do with all the basic functions, from respiration and locomotion to vocal control and so on. So once you up in the higher reaches, I find it easy to sort of give at least a conjectural notion of system. How many systems do you divide the brainstem up into? That's your free choice. I mean, so I would hesitate to give us an explicit number, but I would say that there are very clearly defined systems, and the challenge will be two challenges. What is their generic function, each one of them? Can we define a global function for each one of them that is reflected in the circuitry? And secondly, how do they work together?
But we could also, as a heuristic, go to ethology, or we could go to psychology and say, well, systems are defined around motivation, attention, perception, memory, right? Would you find it a helpful heuristic to follow?
Yes, absolutely. It would come in. For the brainstem, there you would obviously have to deal with motivational systems built in at the very, very basic level, survival related on all kinds of dimensions, and psychology, attention, volition, and so on, abstraction, cognition. Surely. And then now the question comes, how do you interface them with this other way, this division of labor notion?
Mm-hmm.
And much of what psychology looks at, of course, is consciously accessible information. You can ask people in psychophysical experiments, or you can do behavioral experiments, and you extract some kind of functional conception from that. And so you get a class of attentional mechanisms play across the different modalities. So that's probably some system that is doing that, and so on. Now it could conceivably cut across several of these division of labor defined systems. Attention, there is a theory of attention that actually involves the basal ganglia, isn't there? Somebody wrote something about the basal ganglia and attention. Now, normally we don't think of it that way, but where did I see that? Anyway, absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this sort of overall systems decomposition, can we find some, general principles that are even above the level of modules, of subsystems? For example, sort of the Jacksonian principle of layered control.
Yeah.
Would you agree that? Because there you have redundancy or maybe not redundancy, but you have similar functionality at different levels of the brain, but differences.
Very much appealing. I saw one example this afternoon with Giovanni's presentation, where the eye blink conditioning with cerebellar involvement, the eye blink reflex, which is the one without the cue, when just an air puff goes to your eye, that one keeps working. And what you get is you move the beginning of that up. But so when you saw the detailed videos of the eye closing during eye blink conditioning, when the animal was conditioned, you see this slow thing, which is the anticipatory blinking, and then a real squeezing of the eye, which is the old reflex. But here they are both two Jacksonian levels, if you please, both working at the same time in parallel. In that case, there is no reason whatsoever to eliminate the lower one. Let it run. And that, to me, by the way, brings up the very appealing notion that sometimes we think of the systems working together, that you have to switch back and forth between them. But the default procedure ought to be that every system does its generic thing all the time in parallel. And when no other system is sending it input, it idles.
Yeah.
And when it gets something significant, it does its thing on it and sends it back wherever it's gonna send it. So that means that they're running in parallel all the time, and that there would then be some behavioral situations in which you would have to turn off actively a lower level because it interferes with something. But those would be special cases. The default would be multi-level, parallel, running, each one doing their own thing. And like there is the old notion that visual function moves from the colliculus up to cortex. No, a new layer is added with completely new capacities, object vision, and the colliculus keeps doing its old orienting thing, and actually some salient things and so on. So let it do its thing. Why? It's perfectly honed from billions of years of evolution. Let it do its thing and just add new things. And then the new things have to be tied into the old ones. And they are usually tied in by some kind of fiber projection. So absolutely, yeah, a levels thing, I have no problem.
But now we have a bit of a mess, right? Because we start with the anatomy, and it looks like, although you already said, be careful with drawing borders, because it's not so obvious.
Mm-hmm.
But we could think about, okay, but there are like structural divisions, right? I have a brainstem, midbrain, forebrain.
Mm-hmm.
But now, if we take this Jacksonian view together with this more etiological, psychological, functional perspective, it starts to look like at each of these structural systems, all these function elements are actually represented in some form. But as I move forward along the neuraxis, it is starting to become more dependent on, let's say, on memory. It starts to become more dependent on learning properties of the control of these different psychological functions. Right? So how should we now square that circle? How do we get the structure and the function aligned? Because the standard heuristic was always, well, function follows structure. If you understand the structure, you have your head around the function.
Yeah.
But then maybe it's not that straightforward.
In other words, your question is, at each of these levels, even at the most primitive, is there an instantiation at that level of each of the fundamental things? And then you replicate them, but they get more and more sophisticated and more dependent on advanced kind of operations. And naturally, in a lamprey, you have, that's, maybe we don't have to go that far, because what Grillner is showing is that lamprey in this, compared to our brain or a mouse brain, is quite primitive, but it has a basal ganglia and it's divided up pretty much. It sends its subennular for avoidance, projection, and so on. And when he takes a lamprey and lesions the basal ganglia, they get tardive dyskinesia. They suck onto rocks and they won't let go, like a Parkinson patient who can't get going. Now they get stuck in. So even a lamprey has, of course, a telencephalon. So there is presumably never a stage at which only a brainstem works by itself. There is the brainstem itself is a bit hierarchical. And I think the bigger...
Perhaps a developmental state.
Yeah.
Something like the Monodelphis domestica, a possum, where the infants are born extremely juvenile, essentially just a brainstem animal. And what they can do at that age is just cling to the mother. And find the milk and suckle.
And they would be very different from the guinea pig.
I think they're born around 2 weeks after gestation. And you can watch the other parts of the brain begin to kick in. And I think you can probably see some similar things in rats in development. I mean, you can, there is a mutant mouse where there's a gene which controls dopamine. And if this gene is absent, then the dopamine cells don't develop properly. And those mice are fine when they're first born, but by 2 weeks, they're magnetic. So the dopamine system and the basal ganglia, presumably, which has a veto on any kind of voluntary movement. Once that comes in, if there's no dopamine, it won't work. Prior to that,
so they
can generate behavior
deficits at that stage, but not early. Which means that, in a sense, that system comes in a bit late.
So
maybe in a guinea pig, which is born and runs around with incredible competence, because I was set to watch a guinea pig birth. The woman was away, and I had them in a cage, and I didn't realize that the newborns could get through the meshes of the cage within 1 hour of birth. they were running around the place and hiding in places, and I had to chase them down. And it was just as bad as chasing a full-grown rat. So they would be very competent. So there may be developmental schedules that keep these things in for precocity and versus altriciality. Interesting.
And it's interesting in humans that we are precocial in terms of our sensory development, born with our eyes open, but our motor systems are really altricial. So really altricial.
What is interesting in your mouse example, Tony, and maybe that's a riddle also that Bjorn can solve. If you sort of perturb the developmental trajectory, you get severe deficits, right? But if you would take an adult animal and you would lesion the forebrain, then often from the outside they're pretty much functional, right? If they live in a cage, they can take care of themselves. They can take care of their young, right? So it's interesting to see that if you disrupt the developmental pathway, the system apparently is really going towards some attractor that it cannot reach and it collapses. It's pathological, dies. While it wasn't reached that developmental stage, and then you just remove it discreetly, it can still fall back on these earlier layers in its architecture. Right? So why would this bootstrapped system then be so sensitive to perturbation, as the adult system is actually very robust to massive lesions? How would you explain that?
Well, I have thought sometimes about the possibility that there are certain structures whose essential function is to educate the system early on. And once they have done their work, the deficits will be less. And that's approximately rephrasing what you're saying. Now, what I have thought about whether the cerebellum is like that its real use is very early. Of course, later on, we know that you have to recalibrate your VOR when your eyeballs grow and so on. So there are always adjustments that are needed for fine tuning during adult. So it has a function then also, but maybe its real work is being done early.
Exactly. So we haven't really solved the problem yet, right? Because we have a structure, we have a brain structure. There's heterogeneity, not all uniform, but we cannot really draw borders very clearly necessarily, right? It's not clearly modular, but we cannot necessarily map it in some clean way to different functions we might want to see either. And the possibility might be that all functions exist at multiple stages of the system. But still, when we progress along an axis and we go to the telencephalon, the forebrain, there are distinct features that emerge. Would it be fair to say that actually the key thing that's happening is just we're building more advanced memory systems? As we move forward, we build more advanced memory systems, and we have to add features to just control this memory system. Would that be enough?
I think that's absolutely right. I said in my tutorial that as soon as you see a structure in the brain that has big volume with millions and millions and maybe billions of neurons, you should think learning structure, memory structure, something that stores. Because I have this heretical view that there is in every learning system, there is this trade-off between stability and plasticity. Okay. Now, so if you make the synaptic weight changes very rigid, you're gonna not be able to use those for anything else. Well, that has in neural network context, that has been solved by adding new units to the network. And my alternative to that is you start out with a huge information storage capacity and you use it up sequentially as you learn. So there would be sort of some kind of a learning front going through it, using up the tissue. It would be equivalent to the ovaries stocked with all the eggs a woman is going to produce in her entire lifetime, and they're successively released. And here you would start with your full learning capacity and use it up. So it would sort of burn up as you learn, and as you commit more and more synapses in various ways to specific content. And And therefore, when you see, so I have a chapter in that in my 2004 paper in Cortex, a long introduction about the volumetrics of information storage, and the best evidence is in bird vocal learning, where you have this very, very clean correlation between the size of these nuclei and the learning capacity, the complexity of the song that they will acquire. And this goes within species, for individual with different capacities have different size, and it goes across species. Species with very complex repertoires have big nuclei and a big system, and the other ones have smaller. So if you extend that to all learning, you would expect. So if you extend that to all learning, you would say, looking at the brain just like that, you would say, where are the learning structures? Cerebellum, basal ganglia, neocortex. Those are the three voluminous big chunks. And the nice thing in evolution is that they go hand in hand. They are sharply, the regression of volume between cerebellum, neocortex, and basal ganglia raise a sharp correlation. A bigger cortex requires bigger basal ganglia, bigger cerebellum. But the colliculus stays pretty much the same, you know. So if you assume that they are storing information continually through a lifetime, and for everything that you have to adjust to, and using up their storage, but they have to start out big and sequentially use it up.
But in the striates, you didn't include hippocampus. What is that?
No, it's on the top. I include that with the neocortex, with the cortex, not neocortex, but with cortex. Mm-hmm. In my tutorial yesterday, I just said cortex general, and I simply put the hippocampus at the top of the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. So would you have an alternative learning system in the hippocampus from the rest of cortex?
Yeah, it's specialized. One of the reasons is it's at the top of the hierarchy, and it actually converts. It's very very elegant. It converts the supragranularly dominated feed-forward path to the infragranularly dominated feedback path. So from entorhinal up into the hippocampus, you get the feed-forward path, and it comes back in the deep path, in the feedback path. So there's this nice hinge, but of course, the hippocampus preceded neocortex by millions of years, by a long evolutionary history. So it had a separate function long before it became the hinge of the cortical countercurrent.
Are you sure about that? I mean, I think, what are you saying about the evolution of hippocampus?
It preceded only mammals have neocortex, and a lot of vertebrates have the medial pallium is sort of hippocampal analog. It's the anlage of the hippocampus. It grows big only with neocortex because it serves it in very intimate ways. But there is hippocampus and an anlage of amygdala prior to man.
Well, there is a sort of three-layer sort of cortex in reptiles.
Yeah.
And the hippocampus is more sort of, I guess, reptilian with other bits.
Yeah. So it's three. Cortex does sort of three-layer, and then you get this mammalian invention of five-layer cortex, which birds don't have, though their forebrain expands vastly. And they all have a hippocampus. In fact, the hippocampus is one of the very good examples in birds, not only vocal learning, but these food caching jays and scrub jays and stuff. Yeah. Some of them up in Siberia, they've studied them. They hide seeds in tens of thousands of different places. One animal, tens of thousands of places. They know where they are. And the ones who hide, there are different species. The ones that hide in fewer places have smaller hippocampus. The ones that hide in more, thousands and thousands of places, have bigger hippocampus. Very nice volumetrics. Otherwise, the animals are pretty similar.
But then there's something interesting about that, Bjorn, also relative to the architecture of the neocortex, right? Because you indeed see then the hippocampal hinge. This is where feed forward switches back to feedback. Mm-hmm. But there's another pathway like that which runs over frontal cortex, which is receiving more attention in some sense. Yeah. Right? You say, okay, I map forward to frontal cortex, and then the feedback projections come back as well.
Yeah.
So now I have two orthogonal, if you want, hinges in some sense. So how should I think about that?
They are enmeshed. If you look at the connectivity, instead of where they are physically, and you look back at Malcolm Young's beautiful graph theory plot from the macaque, COCOMAC, in 1995, he shows there is this beautiful ventral, this beautiful visual part of the graph, one big thing hanging out to the left. There is the somatosensory in the middle and the auditory coming off on the right. And then there is the gustatory, and they all converge in what he calls the frontal limbic camp. And when you look at this, and when you look at the cortical areas, they are completely enmeshed with reciprocal connections. The hippocampus sits in the middle of the frontal things like a spider in a web. When I saw that, I said, now I understand finally that they are all the highest level of the system. So that hinge is a broader hinge than hippocampus. It's enmeshed. And when simply looking at this graph, you see the densest number of connections are up there. They're all crowded together. Limbic, frontal, and hippocampal is all meshed together. And then the modality-specific streams, hierarchies are hanging off it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the head of the system, and the hippocampus is connectively very close to frontal area, much more distant to visual, for example, than frontal. So it's the next door neighbor to those guys. So
Right.
if you just shrink the fiber lengths, so sometimes the physical positioning of an area can be very deceptive. Here you have at the tip of the middle of the temporal lobe is one of them, and the other one is in frontal cortex, and they are connectively just like that.
Mm-hmm.
And the other deceptive one is the frontal eye fields. Frontal eye fields is placed frontally, but connectively in the Young diagram, it's in the visual system. It's much farther back. It's because his connections, of course, are like rubber bands. So they pull and push till they settle to an equilibrium in his modeling of this. So there you see that really frontal eye fields is high in the visual dorsal stream.
Right. But now more recently, there was another proposal by David Van Essen and Henry Kennedy, where they spoke of this sort of bow tie structure, right, in cortical architecture. That means there's a core at the center of the bow tie that is very densely interconnected. And then there are these two wings of the bow tie that are feeding into it from the periphery or that receive inputs from it, right? And that will give you the bow tie structure.
Yeah.
Is that in your mind still compatible with the older Malcolm Young picture, or is there any change? Did anything change in that picture?
What has changed is that at the time of Malcolm Young, they interpreted it as a small world system. And it was by the evidence they had then. What has happened since, which was updated in this Van Essen, I love that paper. I mean, it's a tremendous synthesis they had done there. They found so many more connections that hadn't been reported back then. And when you add those connections, it's more connected than a small world network should be. And that's how they got the bow tie structure. And it doesn't conflict with the old view. It's simply another version of having an efficient network. And it's to have this sort of super hub in the middle and having sensory things feed into it and things where it projects coming out. But if you look at their diagram, their sort of conceptual sketch of the bow tie, you see one double huge arrow going from the feed forward and the feedback is intact. That whole, and that's the thing that's essential about the Malcolm Young and all the old versions of this, is that feed forward and feedback are streaming against each other all the time. That's sort of the basic.
Right. But now, what you also did yesterday, which I found very interesting. So we have now this outline of the anatomy. We have a feeling maybe for how this mapping to function. But you went a step further by really formulating, at least as a hypothesis, distinct functions of then sort of major subdivisions of the architecture, right? Yeah. So could you step us through those? And
I only did my guesswork on, because it is really, as far as I can tell, they there is no consensus on what these things do in the sense of how to describe them at the very abstract, generic, functional level. For neocortex, my guess is that it's doing veridical source reconstruction across all afferents. You should remember, things like the vestibular system has a cortical representation. Everything is up there. So it wants to make sure it has access, rather direct access, to all the basic sensory systems, including the vestibular. It's quite spectacular, actually. So what do I mean by veridical source reconstruction across all afferents? Its task is to tell us, in a sense, what reality is. And to do that, it needs help from basal ganglia, mostly in terms of how to deal with the world, and from the cerebellum in terms of maybe decorrelation, maybe something else. But there are these very strong anatomical connections from cortex into cerebellum, from cerebellum back. Same thing with basal ganglia. And of course, basal ganglia is serving much more than motor cortex. It's serving vast areas of the cortical mantle, or projecting into the basal ganglia. And then they get down through the funnel and shipped back through the thalamus up to cortex. So division of labor, source reconstruction means because sensory afference is not only noisy, but loaded with so much ambiguity in terms of ill-posed and inverse problems. In vision, for example, there is a whole catalog. I mean, computer vision has been a catalog of working through all the inverse problems that you have to solve to make sense of what's on the retina. Okay, on the retina, if you have a circle on the retina, it could be an ellipse at the tilt. It could be a close ellipse at the tilt, or a small circle close to you, or a big circle far away from you. It could be any number of things. It could be an infinity of stimuli to generate the same retinal image. So how do you tell? Well, in a monocular view, you can't tell. You need some additional cues. So you open two eyes, or you move your head, and suddenly you see, well, it can't be far away because parallax is little. And parallax is much. There's lots of parallax when I move my head, so it must be close. And so you disambiguate. And then you take the help of other systems. You might, if you're really unsure, you might try to touch the thing and see what's actually there. Not as an adult, but early in development. So it has to reconstruct my bet is that cortex is there in order to give us a realistic model of reality. It has to reconstruct from the senses. The auditory system, of course, forget about it. All this noise is impinging on the cochlea, and the first thing it does is a huge Fourier transform. Okay, so it has to reconstruct what's out there from this very indirect, very noisy, very ill-posed and inverse problem riddle sensory afferents. And how does it come to the brain? As chattering of action potentials in millions of fibers. So it's a huge task. And of course, the lower levels that we talked about, they solve these things by simply throwing away information. The colliculus doesn't reconstruct objects. It just knows whereabouts they are when they move and when they shine brightly over there. That's all it cares about. It doesn't have to reconstruct anything that way. Location in space is enough for it. So once it has that, it can direct the eyes there. Its job is done. The cortex wants to know, what is the object like? And therefore it is confronted with all these ambiguities and inverse problems. So it has a huge job. And for me, the hierarchical organization of cortex with feedback and feed forward is to extract priors from its experience with the world to make the next experience clearer, to clarify the view. And so our perception of the world goes from it's sort of an irreversible gain in clarity. We see the world clearer and clearer from infancy and up. And we understand more and more about it. By our age, the perceptual lessons are long gone. They have been handled long ago. We just go about the world. That's the most self-evident thing. So it's so easy to overlook how difficult those problems is. Size constancy, that the thing that's small on the retina can be just as big as this if it's far away. That has to be acquired, and it's acquired first for the proximal space, and then extends out. Size constancy is the progress of size constancy is simply extending the constancy farther and farther out. So some people living evidently in rainforests with dense foliage all around them, with never open spaces, they have a deficient distant size constant. They have very good close, but if you take them out from the rainforest to the plains and they see a gazelle, they've never seen such a small animal.
Mm-hmm.
They were surprised.
Yeah, but
well, I was making this one up.
No, sure, but how does that scale? Because, okay, I can imagine that this is a really good summary if I would be just a passive observer of the world and I want to have accuracy about this.
Yeah.
But in some sense, the brain wants to act.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're toast, right?
We want that.
So how does this model now of neocortex map into the ability of making a decision and matching your goals and building strategies? So how does it generalize to this more active, goal-oriented part of the system?
Where Tony and others come in,
but you have to answer the question.
Frontal basal ganglia circuitry going back to cortex. So first of all, the desirability of an accurate view of accuracy in the reconstruction, the veridical part of it is a big thing. And cortex, instead of like colliculus or other subcortical things, throwing information away and saying, I don't care, I just want a fast solution, like they get instant certainty at the price of permanent ignorance. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you really want to know what's up there, you got to be accurate. So cortex steps back and says, I'm neutral. I'm not making any commitments initially. I simply make it on a probabilistic basis. It's probable that this is a slanted line oriented 45 degrees to the right. Okay. It's a probability. So a tuning curve for orientation in visual cortex is like a probability density distribution. So cortex keeps doing that. And then it starts merging in the hierarchy with feed forward and feedback, the incoming information with the priors. And at some point, it has to collapse these things to an estimate. And that's when we get the best estimate we can get of what's out there. But we have to act, like you say. What do we do about it? We're not just some big eye viewing the world, contemplatively gazing at our navel. Mm-hmm. So how do we get about it? Then you have what you said, goals, motivation. We have to accomplish the things we have to accomplish. We are basically a metabolic engine that converts food into energy. And in dividing up that for all the tasks that need to be accomplished, we have trade-offs. So you can spend all your time searching for a mate. If you don't eat along the way, and it'll allocate enough time for eating, you will starve to death before you find a mate. So, trade-offs: protecting your body, finding food, finding shelter, finding the right environmental circumstances, finding the right social environment. So trade-offs constantly, dividing up the energy to different tasks. And evolution has taken care of a lot of that, saying, look, there are some fundamentals that you have to accomplish. You have to eat. You have to protect your body integrity, pain system. You have social motives. You have fear, protect yourself from danger. And you have curiosity to explore.
Yeah, but I'm not sure you're solving the problem.
Well, you're putting the solution to that part of the problem goes back into the brainstem. With areas like the hypothalamus. But then is there also a sort of layered architecture of motivational systems that you would then trace up into cortex? And how does that link to areas like the hypothalamus?
I would say that it's just like you say, they are up there. Limbic system is the motivational layer, in a sense, the motivational compartment of cortex for for some of the motivational systems. Not only that, but frontal cortex, orbital frontal and so on is shot through with motivational things like social and so on. And it's all gonna now. The problem about cortex and action is that the cortex is doing this big sort of objective reconstruction of the world, but it's doing it in parallel. And action goes serially, one action at a time, essentially. And how do you convert this huge parallel display of incredible amounts of information, including motivational information in frontal and limbic? How do you get it down to behavior? You have to have something that converts that in a sense sequences action based on the best evidence that all those parallel areas are supplying to it. And it seems to me that that's done by piping it into the striatum and into the basal ganglia, which looks to me like a big funnel, which whittles things down to a narrower and narrower compass, substantial. No, that's the final one, but the globus pallidus externa is bigger than interna, and nigra is smaller than that. So it's a big funnel. It gets narrower and narrower because parallel things are now competing, and you're selecting the most urgent thing along the way till finally there is an eyeball signal that says, okay, that one, release it. It has won a competition along the way, in a sense, through the basal ganglia. It's like an obstacle race. There are all these other, at the caudate putamen, there are all these other guys competing. You know, there's a topography there from cortex, all these other guys competing. And the further down you get, the more they have knocked out the competitors, and one is going to win. That's the one that right now is going to be acted on. And next comes the next runner-up who is busy. He still wants to get to control the system. And that's the next one. So now that this one is accomplished, urgency for this one is lessening. The next guy wins, and so on. How that's worked out in circuitry, I can't tell you. But that's my intuitive sense of this funnel, this narrowing thing down to the little nigra in the.
So that means, in your mind, the whole process of actually comparing, deciding, evaluating, so on, is a process playing out at basal ganglia level, right?
Frontal basal ganglia, yeah.
Yeah, but cortex is only dealing with building little models,
yeah,
of whatever states you might care about.
But it's also hierarchical. So superordinate goals are in frontal, and so they are gonna. And if you look at the weighting of input from cortex to the striatum, you have the tail of the caudate. That's where visual, where sensory stuff gets in. And the farther frontal you get, the more massive is the input to the striatum. So the striatum is biased towards frontal input. And that's because it's high level. It's big thing.
It cares about things that are talking to the motor system.
Yeah. It can.
The bits of cortex that directly or indirectly talk to the motor system. So only visual.
Yeah.
Cortex. It doesn't speak.
That doesn't matter much there, but there still is a little bit. It still keeps an eye open a little bit, but massively for the motor related things.
And we just talk about sort of early and late attention. So in a sense, the basal ganglia is late attention. It's you already identified some candidate action plans, and you're now down to choosing, which of a small number of things to do, rather than cortex calculating everything that you could possibly do, and having to choose between thousands.
Yeah.
So, and so there's a lot of ways of resolving those competitions that don't require maybe the secretive basal ganglia, but operate through then maybe attractor, type dynamics in cortex.
Yeah, I perfectly agree. It makes eminent sense. And there was something that it reminded me of, which is that the reinforcement learning thing makes perfect sense in that context of the whittling down of competitors from a parallel thing to a serial thing. Because now, if there is this successive obstacle race across narrower and narrower competition, then you can go in with a reinforcement signal, the outcomes that were successful. You can say, mark that one. That's a good one. Let that one slip by faster next time. That was a good one. So you can start marking in the basal ganglia, marking synapses or whatever constellation of activity it is by reinforcement learning and outcome, because that's what action tells you. Is outcomes.
Yeah, but look, I know you threw in basal ganglia to pacify Tony, and it seems to be working. So that's problematic because you threw in something else that you haven't accounted for. Because the starting point is, and this very meditative brain, I care about having very accurate reconstructions of the sources of my sensory stimulation in the outside world, and I use a form of predictive coding for that, right? Okay, fine. I can buy that for let's say everything up to the central sulcus from the occipital cortex.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
So yeah, you have dealt with that part.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is not talking to basic area. Now you say, okay, now if you go more frontal, then goals come. But you haven't already told me how I use that same hardware, that cortical hardware, to get this goal representation. How do the goals come in? Where do they come from?
High levels of the sensory hierarchy are ideas and concepts. High levels of the motor hierarchy are plans, goals, and intentions. So,
but can't we say everything that is more, let's say, parietal looks at the outside world. Everything more frontal looks at the inside world.
It looks towards action.
No, but if you go intentions,
no, but that's what are they for? They are tying you up. They are tying up your trade-offs tremendously. As soon as you've set out the goal to be the greatest guitarist in the world,
that's Tony. Tony is.
Oh, I know you. So that wasn't why I picked it.
You try again, right? First, now guitar. What else? Soon it'll be Sheffield.
World's greatest guitars. That eliminates a lot of stuff right off. You're now going to spend 8 hours a day. You're narrowing your options by setting up such a goal. So what was that an answer to? Something you just said?
I was saying, would it be fair to say that then everything in front of the central sulcus cares about states of the internal environment?
Yeah.
And you were not convinced by that.
So now you try to give me... Yes, I objected. And the reason for that is that goal you're setting up is really not so much you feel it in that sense it's internal, but it really has to do with your fate in the world, your trajectory through this world that you have built up objectively. How am I going to get to that place? And it now eliminates, once you have set up the future goal, and goals are always in the future, once that's set up, you are constraining action in very, very concrete and basic ways, because now you can't play all day. Now you have to practice and so on. So though they are internal in the sense that you feel an impulse to do something or a desire to be that great artist or an ambition, that's the internal part, and of course that's related to what I said about motivational systems being enmeshed with the frontal. That's why Jung calls it frontal limbic. Frontal limbic is a very nice concept. So naturally there is this, and there is an insulin for interoceptive things.
Yeah.
So naturally, but ultimately, I would say goals and planning is that the big topic, the overriding topic, is action. Is how
okay, so now we have an idea, at least of the cortical hierarchy, and now in some sense we have a more, let's say, at a microscopic level, we have to now start thinking about how all this information is represented and passed along between all these circuits, right? And some time ago you wrote a fantastic review on gamma responses in the brain, which I would think you wouldn't also see as a possible substrate for this kind of information exchange.
He's baiting me.
You're on to me now.
I'm on to you.
So,
I'm on to you.
was that easy? Okay, but the point is, you do have it, because now we talked about in abstracto about these cortical hierarchies, but now signals have to pass between all these different stages. So how should I think about that? How does that happen?
Well, my answer to that is what passes is signal energy, not messages. And how does it pass? It always passes through fibrobundles that are coherently organized, essentially most of the time in point-to-point topographies. They may be broken up by interleaved columns, but across the columns you're still maintaining the topography. From map to map, there are these transformations from map to map, and there are examples of actually twisted fibrobundles, like from cortex apparently down to the precerebellar nuclei in the pons. There's this weird topology, and then it pipes up to the cerebellum. But anyway, so my take on the interaction, how they work together, would be that each system is doing its specialty all the time, and
But the signal exchange was the question.
Yeah.
How do they exchange signals?
by their projections. When
Yeah, but what is the signal? Where's the message? Is it
not a
only
message.
the firing rate?
There isn't any message. Well, you're setting traps for me. Rate coding, yes.
Really?
Yes.
And
That's
those
the
are labeled
that's the
lines.
more fundamental question here, because you said at lunch you wanted computational, as you said just now. It's energy, not messages. But you've also talked very much in sort of representational terms about what's happening in cortex. So these are two things which are quite hard to square, because if you want to go down a sort of really hardcore dynamicist route, you wouldn't mention the word representation in your language either. You would say the brain is just in tune with its body and the environment in such a way that, it bounces between appropriate protractors so that the animal does the right thing in the right time. But all of your language is actually about modularity and decomposition. It all sounds like the kind of thing that computationalists would love.
Yeah, and I am definitely not in the dynamicist camp and the dynamic systems camp. But in terms of my representational talk is because what I see those cortical areas as are two-dimensional maps, and those maps are topographically organized. Neighborhood relations are preserved in projections from area to area. They form a hierarchy, and there is a pattern on each map. You've seen the famous Toutel picture of when they showed a macaque a bullseye with 2-deoxyglucose, and they developed the films, and they showed the beautiful transformed image and visual cortex. A lot of people misunderstood Yuval and Weasel when they said that the stimulus is taken apart into orientation, color, and so on. They said that locally, and people started thinking globally, but they also said equally emphatically that as you move the electrode across V1, you are crossing the columns, and over distance you are maintaining the retinal topography. So there's an image in V1. There is a physical pattern of different activation states, and I treat the neurons as pixels in a picture. Essentially, that's my metaphor. A very abstract metaphor. There are pixels in a picture on a screen, and what happens across the hierarchy is it gets transformed. The screens get smaller and smaller. They get more and more abstract, and they are interacting.
Look, this sounds a little bit like what people have described as morphological computation, computation in the context of the brain.
Yeah.
You're taking advantage of the geometry.
Yes.
And the physical hardware of the brain to do computation for you.
Aren't you describing a complete disaster now? I mean,
Well,
we were doing so well.
Yes.
It sounded so convincing. And we could agree.
What you say with morphological computation fits very well with how I think, and I call it analog computation.
Right.
But that will not pacify me. Because now suddenly we completely switched perspectives, and we talk about maps, 2D maps that are wired, conserving some sort of topography between them. On the other hand, we talk also about hierarchical feed-forward, top-down relations.
Yeah.
So that means I have a forward and backward, topographically preserving projections between all these maps. So you're going to run out of wires very quickly.
Not at all. The wires are fixed.
That doesn't solve my problem.
The interaction between feed-forward and feedback simply changes the synaptic weights and fills those areas in the hierarchy.
Never scale, Bjorn.
What's that?
How can it scale? Because here you have this sort of Buddha brain that just contemplates the world and it tries to estimate the sources of its sensory stimulation. The world is all practically infinitely variable. And in your case, I have to capture all that content by really labeling individual connections with a certain meaning, right?
No. There are no labels.
There's no way to escape from that.
There are no labels.
You have labeled lines. You must.
Why?
Because you have topography preserving maps. So if you want to encode any combination of features, it is a combination of features expressed by activities and locations in such a map. And locations in the map must be conserved as you move them through such a hierarchy. So if I now want to have, let's say, a location invariant representation of your head, and I want to also have a rotation invariant representation of your head, there are a lot of wires going between these maps.
That's way up in the hippocampus, or way up next to the hippocampus, in the parahippocampal, and that's where those recognition things are. That's your knowledge of a rotation and an abstract hat is not this hat. This hat is located in a specific place on your maps, all the way up through the inferotemporal cortex. They still maintain topography all the way down through inferotemporal cortex. When you get up to HT and parahippocampal and entorhinal, that's when you start breaking down topography. And once you are in hippocampus, you are in a sparse map, which is, a lot of people don't understand that the place cells that are responding to a single location in a rat's cage are spread all over the hippocampus through the cross section. And a scattering, it looks like pepper, like scattered, and the guys next to them is another subset of hippocampal cells. So there is no spatial map in the colliculus or the visual one sense in the hippocampus. That's an abstract map that's for storing the maximum amount of information in a finite number of cells. But I'm not running out of pixels or wires, because the screens, the maps, the two-dimensional maps, just metaphorically think of them like a TV screen. You're not running out of TV pixels because you're showing a movie on them. They are scintillating and changing all the time. And what they are displaying is every one of the areas has a different content depending on where it is in the hierarchy. And that has to do with the priors.
For instance, example. Anatomically, it's a fact that interareal synapses landing into a volume of cortex, but the process coming from another part of cortex, or the long-range interactions, is less than 3-2%. It's minimal. It's very sparse. Yeah. I love it. But in your proposal now, I think you would need way more than this 2% to wire your system together to be able to be this meditating Buddha who can say, it's a box here.
I don't quite see why.
Okay.
We maybe Kawato did a very nice. Well, that was.
But this is a testable prediction, right? So we should make a prediction what kind of wiring ratios you would get local, global, and whether they match what you find the real thing. Right?
I mean, when I read Young back then, his numbers for density of interconnection. But remember, those 2-3%, they are not scattered randomly. They are in register. They're always in register.
Right.
even though they're
So
few.
okay, so we will finish this over dinner. I think that because we need maybe some wine to go along with this, but
Yeah.
because we're speculating,
Mhm.
and we know you don't like that. But so Bjorn, with your long career in many fields, which is amazing, right? You've been in many fields, and you had impact in many fields, from music to neuroscience to humans' understanding of mushrooms. You've been all over the place, right? Which is really astonishing.
Vedic exegesis, I have solved puzzles that Vedic translators have not managed to solve in the Rig Veda.
Mm-hmm.
And I published a paper in Mongolian Studies where I solved 4 puzzles in Vedic translation that nobody had solved. And the reason was I had studied the steppe nomads' religious ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And the steppe has a common culture. Their nomads are going back and forth. The Rig Veda, where steppe people came down into India, and they carried some of their lore from the steppe with them. And knowing what they thought about the stars and so on, I could solve problems. So Rig Veda exegesis without knowing Sanskrit.
But now you do know Sanskrit.
No, I don't.
No, okay.
No, never learned.
Ah, okay. But I heard you sing the girl from Ipanema once in Sanskrit.
Oh yeah, but that was I had memorized it.
Ah, okay, good.
Memorized
Okay.
it.
So
Summertime.
Oh, it was summertime. Sorry, my mistake. But okay, look, this broad experience that you bring to the table here.
Mhm.
What is Bjorn's law that we should follow in order to understand how the brain works?
First of all, forget about language. That's the last thing you want to look at. Once you've solved all the rest of it, you can add language probably easily. So forget about language, and messages and so on are language-based metaphors. Look at analog computers, how you would solve these things analog-wise, which would be morphological computation in a sense. And third one, I think that's enough.
Okay. So then we'll visit you soon in Christianstadt, about 3 years from now, to check whether you actually have falsified or verified your key hypothesis on how the brain works. So what hypothesis would you like to see really tested in a 3-year time frame?
That's a good question. That's a nice question.
Finally, we have a question you liked.
Well, I liked all of them. So you got trying to trick me on the gamma and the gamma. What was the other one? Yeah, you tried to trick me on gamma and the one on the. No, you were trying to trick me. You just wanted to ask you a question. Let's see.
Prediction
For the future.
And it's also one that Tony can appreciate, because he's going to come to Christianstadt to check whether it actually happened.
Okay.
Yeah. In winter, he shouldn't be too pleasant.
I'm trying to get out of this field now.
So you get a prediction and walk away, right? Just not be home when Tony rings the doorbell.
Let's see. My dream experiment, my dream research line on 3 years from now with an answer, what would that be? Hell, I can't think.
Well, I think, given our discussion, an obvious one would be that you're going to prove that your topographically conserving architectures can scale.
I know now. Okay.
But I mean too supportive.
I know now. It's not that. I lightly touched upon the fact that cortex works probabilistically.
Yeah.
But you need an estimate. Okay. And there is work that shows that as long as cortex works on a probabilistic basis, its transmission is fast. Its operations are fast. As soon as you try to constrain cortex to precipitate an estimate, things not crash but slow down. And I forget now the name of the people who suggested that. So probabilistically, cortex is fast, and Mumford back in the 90s. I had a couple of papers on cortico-thalamic relations. And in the abstract of one of them, he says estimates are made in the thalamus. And I am on that line. I think that cortex is working on a probabilistic basis. And when it is time to make an estimate for actual action things, those are made in subcortical locations, and like basal ganglia for action, colliculus for prioritization and orienting. And I think the thing I would like to be tested is there a global best estimate of the whole, where the whole probabilistic panoply of cortical areas, where all that information is collapsed to one single estimate of my best now in the moment estimate of what's happening around me.
But this sounds like your brain, your cortex, which already had a problem with representing all these topographic maps, now has to support a full panoply of Bayesian probabilistic estimates of different interpretations of the world and maintain those at the same time.
Yeah,
I mean, do you really want to say that that's what the brain is doing?
I want testing whether that happens in the pulvinar.
That it collapses.
There's massive convergence of multiple higher order cortical areas. Most of the V1 projects to the pulvinar, but the dorsal pulvinar, which is what I'm looking at, has this massive convergence from a lot of higher areas, both frontal and parietal and temporal. Okay. So there is this convergent place, and it's invested with a special inhibitory interneuron that exists no other place in the thalamus, and they're long-range inhibition in the dorsal, discovered by Kathy Rockland. And that place, to me, looks like a place that might be ideally placed to make a global best estimate in the moment of what all the cortical information amounts to in terms of one global estimate. And you need sort of a global estimate because some of the things are not disambiguated until you have put them all together. McGurk effect, you look at somebody's mouth and they say one syllable and another one comes into your earphones and so on.
Actually, it's all the time with Tony.
Yeah. So,
but that's also then your conscious C. The conscious C.
That's the conscious C. Mm-hmm. So if that could be tested in 3 years, I would be very happy.
But your prediction will that will be true. This will be consistent.
Yes, there will be a global base estimate in the dorsal pulvinar. That's my prediction.
Fantastic.
A clearer prediction you can't get.
Very good. Bjorn Merker, thank you very much for this conversation.
Wonderful. I enjoyed it.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.